Hello and welcome to Fidelity Connects. I'm Pamela Ritchie. The federal election is just days away and a record 7.3 million Canadians have already cast their ballots. With costed platforms now released by each major political party, how do each compare on key issues like taxes, housing, and economic recovery? We're very pleased here today to be joined by Canada's former top civil servant, Michael Wernick, for a look at how the election trail is unfolding and what Canada's first 100 days with a new Prime Minister might look like. Michael served as a 23rd Clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary to Cabinet from 2016 to 2019. So with 28 years as an executive in the federal public service, including 17 years in the community of deputy ministers and 3 as clerk, Michael is one of Canada's most experienced and influential public sector leaders. So before we dive into our conversation with Michael, I just want to remind all of you that today's webcast features live French audio interpretation if you'd like to use that. A warm welcome to you, Michael. Thank you. This must be a fairly interesting, busy time, but a lot of people want your attention. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for your interest. Glad to be with you.
Well, we're very glad to have you here. So let's actually, if you don't mind, just remind us, we might sort of know from our high school civics classes, but what do you do as Clerk of the Privy Council?
Yeah, it's a great question. The job has existed for about 800 years. It's literally in the title, Secretary to the Council that advises the King. And that would have been some guy with a quill pen in Tudor days. It's evolved to supporting cabinet and supporting the Prime Minister. So yes, there's a corner desk in the cabinet room, and a lot of the job is tending to the flow of issues through cabinet. But the other way to look at it is every minister in cabinet has some lead civil servant, usually a deputy minister running a department. And the clerk is essentially the deputy minister to the Prime Minister, Prime Minister's department being the Privy Council office. And a lot of what you do is supporting the unique roles of PM plays as head of government, chair of cabinet, international leader, First Minister in the Federation, and so on. So it's made up of a lot of little shops that are devoted to the particular functions a Prime Minister plays in our system of government. So there's no equivalent in Washington, for example.
You're sort of a CEO to all of the pieces there in terms of the administration and getting things done.
Yeah, but to be clear, it's not a command and control job. Like you don't have direct executive authority. That's spread across the heads of agencies and departments. It's more that your proximity to the Prime Minister and your convening power and your influence over appointments and promotions means that deputy ministers listen to you, but it isn't a sort of command and control like the armed forces.
Is there a connection to the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, that's particular? Because sometimes they do some of those things, don't they?
Yeah, every minister has a political staff that comes in and tends to their caucus issues and partisan issues and a lot of communications and so on. And so, whether you're at agriculture or fish, there's a relationship between the civil service and the minister's political staff. And the same thing applies to the Prime Minister. So most prime ministers have had a team of about 70 or 80 people that tend to their political agenda. And there's just a constant dialogue and back and forth about keeping, the government's agenda moving forward. And I often describe it as a triangle with the Prime Minister at the top, the political office at one apex and the public service at the other. And, when you have a good relationship, you get a lot done.
So interesting. Okay, let's talk about relationships and how this all works. So you've been through a few transitions. This is where a whole new government is elected, and they need some marching orders. There is an order and a plan, and you help coordinate that. What is the transition like in the early days? And then maybe we'll extend it to sort of the first 100 days. But in the first sort of week or so, what happens?
Yeah, this was always going to be an election year, so people have been thinking about the agenda of government, what government will be asked to do, and some clarity has come in over the last few weeks, through party platforms and so on. But the early days are really a kind of a startup routine, mostly about personnel. Sifting through who wins on Monday, maybe waiting for a recount or two, deciding who's going to go into cabinet roles and which one. Setting up structures of cabinet, committees and focal points, and so that you've set up your decision-making processes for what comes later. Those You can change them later, but those early decisions tend to create a pattern that sticks for a while. They'll be recruiting people into the political staff. People will come in from the election team in the party and take jobs in PMO. Others will stay outside and so on. And at some point fairly early on, there'll be one of those ceremonies where ministers get sworn in. Tag, you're it. You're now the Minister of Agriculture, and away you go. And we call it transition because it's transition from election to governing, and governing starts right away.
So, I mean, they get given a whole bunch of files. What does it look like? They have to make decisions pretty quickly. How does that all come?
It would depend where you are. I mean, every context is going to be very different. In this case, the trade war is obviously going to be, front and center. It's been going on in real time during the election. Those would be early issues. It just turns out that there's a lot of international issues. The Prime Minister is going to be welcoming the G7 leaders to Kananaskis in June. That's a big undertaking, and there's a lot of diplomacy associated with that. He'll be off to the NATO summit in June. Probably has to have something to say about defense and spending. But it's kind of like booting up. You'll have to decide on a parliamentary agenda. How soon do you want to bring the House back? At least think about your first 4 or 5 moves on the chessboard. What are the bills that are really important to get moving quickly? How soon do you want to have a budget? Those sorts of things, and then issues and events take over. The hardest thing in government is staying on course and staying on agenda, because you're always rocked by new things coming in, surprises, and people expect their governments to respond quickly to them.
Let's pick one thing out of that, the budget. We haven't really had one in a while, and in any case, it had a whole bunch of different pieces for how revenue and tax revenue ultimately is going to come into the government. That has changed significantly, some of that policy already. How quickly can a budget come? How quickly should it come? We haven't had one in a long time.
Well, I think in terms of clarity to investors, lenders, borrowers, and markets, I think there's a case to at least have an economic statement early that says this is our best sense. You build budgets up from an economic forecast, growth and income and interest rates and exchange rates.
Well, that's really tough right now, an estimate.
It's very tough. It always is, and the Department of Finance uses an array of forecasters and discards the high and the low forecasts and goes down the middle. And, so you can lay out your assumptions about oil prices and interest rates and so on. That'll be particularly difficult this year, for sure. We're living in times of uncertainty. And that's why, I think the platforms that were released this week, it's helpful to voters to get a sense of priorities. But the numbers won't really survive contact with writing the first budget and the ups and downs of the economy that we're likely to see for the foreseeable future.
When you and I spoke, just to sort of get a thoughts of what we might have as a discussion today, the platforms had not been released. This is last week. And you said you really wanted to do the math on them, just, like I think every Canadian voting did. What'd you get?
Well, I mean, there's a debate going on about, sort of the reliability of some of the economic assumptions. I'll leave that to the Parliamentary Budget Office and others. The thing is, like, there are a lot of things the government will have to deal with that weren't in the platforms, that will affect the revenue and affect the pressures on spending. So, when you actually sit down and write a budget, it's almost like a big spreadsheet. You add up your revenue sources and you look at your spending draws, and you look at the number in the bottom right corner to see what kind of deficit and borrowing is required. And if you don't like that, you go back and you scrub the revenues, or you scrub the spending. You can get one out in a hurry, but you may end up having to revise the assumptions and revise the measures, with a fall economic statement and so on.
Tell us a little bit about transitions that you've been through. So when the Trudeau government came in, it was actually sort of known as actually pretty young and a bit green. The Harper government as well. Just tell us a little bit about how slightly different feels that you've walked through in terms of transition moments were. What are a couple of war stories, battle stories?
I think 2 things there. I mean, when people come in that are new to governing, and it could be, the Prime Minister, and we're definitely going to have a new Prime Minister this time. The incumbent really isn't on the ballot. I don't count the sort of 40 days for Mr. Carney. So you're going to have somebody in the PM's chair who hasn't really done it before. and a mix of ministers, some of whom have experience and some of whom don't. It's really getting a hang of the job that's the most stressful thing for them. But they settle in. Some of them learn very quickly and get the hang of the job. Some of them never do. It just kind of overwhelms them. So a lot of it is about sort of learning the trade craft, and then you sort of reach a steady state where people are taking decisions and doing consultations and making events. I remember very vividly the mood at the first cabinet meetings when a group has won an election and comes in, especially from opposition. You've spent 9 or 10 years in opposition, and now you're inside the castle walls, and you get to make decisions, pass laws, do things. And there's an electricity in the room. They're just very excited and ambitious, and we're finally going to get to do the things we want to do. And they're always motivated by their sense of what's the best thing for the country. And I have a lot of respect for people that go into public life, but I remember that kind of energy and ambition, whether it was the Martin government or the Harper government or the Trudeau government. Pretty soon they get banged up and scarred and worn down. Governing is hard, but those first days are really quite exciting.
Yeah, I bet. So how do they get ready a little bit? Like, how are the departments, for instance, getting ready? There's a lot of stuff that there's actually an awful lot of policy that wasn't done because Parliament's been prorogued for so long. How much of that stuff sort of gets put
I kind of describe it as a blending exercise, maybe a cake making batter or something like that, if you forgive the metaphor. Obviously the platform and the campaign promises matter. People will hold the government to account of how many promises they kept. They'll keep score. They'll put out report cards. And did you do the same things that you said you would do? So that's the sort of foundational element. But as you say, there's a legacy of all kinds of issues from the previous parliament or that are just lurking out there. All of those bills that died on the order paper in January, Mr. Carney, Mr. Poilievre have to decide, do I resume work on the AI bill, the online harms bill, do I modify them, do I discard them? You have to come up with a parliamentary agenda. And then, any number of things from, will just come in as things that the government's expected to have a view on. It's a lot of lists, a lot of calendars. You're off to the G7. You might be, if you're the Minister of Agriculture, you might be off to some sort of, meeting with your peers and so on. And then there's always the known unknowns that governments get ready for. We know there'll be a forest fire and flood season. We know there are things that governments just have to worry about and be ready for. It gets very crowded very quickly, I guess is what you can say. And not all of it is foreseeable. But really the art in the transition, to get to your question, is you're telling ministers as in a deferential, respectful way, yes, we're going to work really hard on your promises, but there's these other things that you probably need to know about because you're accountable.
Okay, so let's go into some of the big questions. There's certainly a discussion of, to whatever extent it comes, we're watching Doge. It's scary, I think, for a lot of people in the public service to be watching some of these cuts. That said, there'll be those that say this is what has to happen. What is that discussion like in Ottawa right now about thinning the public service, basically? Maybe not quite so harshly, but because of AI, because of technological advance.
Yeah, I'm not working with either transition team, so you just have to look for clues in the platform.
What are the clues we should look for in the platform?
Yeah, there's a lot of attention to the body count and the number of public servants because of the growth, certainly in the federal level. Some of it's happened in provincial and local government as well. I would always work backwards from what are they working on, which ones, where, which programs, which services, which professions, which locations. 2/3 of them are not in Ottawa, and so if you really want to change the trajectory of the size of the public service, you inevitably have to go to some kind of spending and program review that looks at what are they working on, and that might be the outward-facing programs, or it might be the internal functions. There are certainly, there are many ways to get into this, and ultimately, it's an important part of that budget spreadsheet that I talked about before, but the entire wage bill of the public service is about $60 billion. So you cut it by 10%, which would be a lot. by historical standards. That's $6 billion. That's a lot of money, but in a $450 billion government, it's not going to solve your debt and deficit trajectory.
Okay. Well, it's really interesting because, of course, for most companies and for most organizations, the body count is the biggest expense, or in a lot of cases it is anyway. So not always, but it often is. Tell us a little bit about the nature of the crisis that we're in right now. Governments have dealt with crises all the time. And some of them are really big. Some of them are 9/11. Some of them are, where policy has to follow up and re-regulate the financial community, and very, very serious. This is a known unknown, I guess you might say. Yeah. Is it really lighting the fire under government that we think it is? I know we're days away from elections, so we don't really know, but is there any way to understand what sort of volume of change we might see due to this current crisis?
Yeah, it's a good question, and frankly, I don't have enough contact with the political teams to be sure. I think that before the election and before Donald Trump, we were having a big conversation about malaise in the Canadian economy and productivity and growth, and we need to do some big, bold things to get the government, get the economy on a better, growth and economic track. That's been, overshadowed by, the trade war and, frankly, an existential question about the future survival of the country. So it's a very new context that governments are going to be working in over the next little while. There's just so many aspects of this, from the security relationships to particular sectors of the economy, whether it's energy or manufacturing, the impact of AI and so on. So it's going to be a very, very busy time for decision makers in the private sector, sitting around board tables in private sector firms and also around the cabinet table.
What do you think big companies want from Ottawa right now? If you had to make
I'm sure they would like stability, but I don't know that they're going to get a lot of it.
Maybe programs going in at it from sort of chunks of programs. There's a lot of discussion of opening up resources, right, for better investment there.
Sure, and so the art of the next 3-4 months is to turn these aspirations and directional things to concrete sort of laws, policies, programs. There's an enormous amount of work to unpack them and to do them. It's easy to say we will speed up, approvals of resource projects. You actually have to get into the wiring of those regulatory processes. The Indigenous consultation obligation has not gone away. We can easily, screw that up and end up with blockades and the same kind of issues we saw, in the past. So, or becoming more self-sufficient or autonomous in parts of the economy, pivoting our trade towards Europe. These are all, important directional things the government can set, but actually executing them is going to be, a slog through programs and laws and regulation and so on. I think one of the stressors for the next government, whoever it is just overall bandwidth. I mean, there's a case for a big spending review. There's a case that was being made before for, an overhaul of the tax system. And there's certainly a case for an overhaul of the regulatory system. I don't know that the political system, never mind the public service, has the bandwidth to do all three simultaneously. So probably, the important early conversations are going to be about sequencing and, which ones to tackle first.
That's really interesting. Do you get a sense that defense will be a big part of this discussion in terms of sequencing?
I mean, you can just see that
it's
coming.
Not really in the platforms in the way that maybe some people want
to. And to be kind, I don't think the parties have been very candid with Canadians about the implications of that. I mean, it's not hard to do the arithmetic. The current commitment is 2% of GDP. Everybody expects that to be raised to 3% of GDP at the June summit. So there's pressures to go even higher, but let's take 3%. 3% of GDP is $90 billion a year, and the government spends $450 now. That's a lot of money. So, how fast you want to get there is one issue. The other issue would be spend it on what? Navy, Air Force, drones, satellites. There's a whole bunch of decisions about what capabilities are important to us. But the bigger one, I guess, for the first budget is where are you going to find that money? You can borrow. That's what the Germans are doing. You can raise taxes for it, which I would advocate for, but I mean, that's not going to be popular during an election campaign. or you can try to cut other things and make some room. But I don't think the arithmetic's going to find you $90 billion a year.
Okay. So then what? I mean, so all
We have to have a
three?
candid conversation as Canadians. If this is a Churchillian moment of national survival, are we prepared to actually, make some sacrifices, in order to pay for the kind of defense and security and intelligence and cybersecurity capabilities that we're going to need to be more autonomous and more resilient?
What does a sacrifice look like?
Taxes.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. So a tax reform could go hand in hand with trying to figure out defense, in theory.
Well, tax reform is usually described as sort of the mix, right?
Yep.
I mean, the level of taxation is just how much revenue do you want to generate? Right now it's about 13% of GDP, give or take. I think when people start talking about tax reform, it's more about the mix between income tax, corporate tax, sales tax, property taxes, and so on. In the overall OECD context, Canada leans more heavily on income tax and lightly on consumption taxes. And orthodox economists would say we probably should lower income taxes and corporate taxes and raise more of our revenue through the consumption tax. But you can imagine the politics of raising the GST.
Right. But it would be nice for people to maybe have less on the income side. And
yeah, I mean, a productivity agenda, and conventional economists would say you should reduce taxes on income and investment, and you should tax consumption. But that's one of those things that's easy to say but hard to do in political terms.
Right. Fascinating. So, but could they go hand in hand, sort of a rethink of taxing and defense? I mean, for the purposes of defense?
Well, it's always open. This is a question of political will. I mean, you could say we're going to create a specific defense and security tax, use the GST base, throw a 2-cent surtax on for 10 years and collect the money and ensure that it is only spent on defense and security. That's totally doable. The Germans had a solidarity tax after reunification where they dedicated a tax that went into investments in the former East Germany and so on. That's all doable. It's more of a question of the politics of it, whether people would want to see that. And again, then you just get to the next issue: spend it on what? Which are the capabilities that are most important to our future?
So the Privy Council has become that much more important. How do you feel about the readiness of lifetime members to understand their significant task? And do you need to get more qualified candidates now? That's interesting, like populating the department that you were head of.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, the department are sort of career civil servants. A lot of them are rotational. They come in, the shop that deals with foreign policy brings in people from global affairs or defense or CSIS, and they come and spend a few years servicing the cabinet process, learn about how cabinet works, and then go back to their home departments. So there's a constant refresh of new people and new ideas coming in with experience in the areas that they work on, whether it's social policy or intergovernmental relations or whatever. And it's a bit of an apprenticeship that's important, for growing the senior management cadre of that layer of deputy ministers and so on. It's a good idea to have worked in the cabinet process and understand, how that works and what a good pitch for policy looks like and all the constraints that a government operates under. But it's also good to have worked in a line department pushing rocks uphill for a specific minister, which I did at Canadian Heritage and what was then called Indian and Northern Affairs. So the best public service careers, you do both, the sort of send and receive part of policy making. And it's, I think it's also important to bridge the gap between policy and delivery, that people that are sort of, working in rather academic policy shops need to get their hands dirty on delivery of programs and how that works and vice versa. So
thank you, because that fills in a lot of gaps, sort of that question brings up. The issue of management consultants has been very much in the political news lately. In your mind, what is the role of a so-called consultant? I mean, it's a pretty wide ranging term. I guess.
I mean, it's one of these issues that's turned into political theater. If you look at it more closely, and I've written an article about this, you always are going to want to use outside expertise and contractors. There are only three ways to get work done in the public service. One is permanent public servants. We talked about that. Temporary public servants who come in for a surge around a specific thing, or outside contractors. And often the cost-effective thing to do is to bring in people from outside, do a turnkey project and leave. But you don't want to bulk up, the body count of tenured public servants. And, in terms of the technological change that's, sweeping through customer relationships and internal processes, and certainly the arrival of AI, that expertise isn't lying around inside government departments. It's in the consultancies that work with the banks, the tech firms, the airlines, and so on. So I think there's always a role for the outside consultancies to bring in knowledge and expertise of practice and apply it to public sector problems. I think the pushback that we're experiencing is, have we created too much dependency on those firms? But I think there's a smart way of dealing with vendors where there's a transfer of knowledge and capabilities. I chide both political parties because they've said in their platforms they want to reduce the use of consultants and contractors. They haven't then gone to the next step and said, we're going to increase the investment in training and leadership development of the public servants.
Okay, really interesting, which obviously is a big piece of what needs to come in terms of retraining.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, you live in Ottawa, you're within the Jarlowski chair at the University of Ottawa, and you spent many years in Ottawa. What's the buzz in Ottawa right now? We're days away from election. Is it different from other elections? What's it like?
I suspect a lot of people are worried about the game against the Leafs tonight, but anyway. Yeah, Ottawa's a peculiar sort of town. It has a tech community. There was a point in the early 2000s when there were more people working for the private sector than the public sector in Ottawa, but after the tech bubble, that shrunk. And it's a town with universities and diplomats and politicians and lobbyists and all kinds of people that are sort of in and around the processes of government. So it's probably a community which is more focused on politics and policy than, a lot of other places. And to be fair, it has been buffered from some of the big swings and ups and downs that we've seen in, markets in places like Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary. So, it is a different community, but it's the fourth largest community in Canada. It is, we're 1.5 million strong and an important part of, the national fabric.
Yep, it's a beautiful city. Michael Wernick, an absolute delight to have your sort of behind-the-scenes expertise, and we wish you very well. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for your interest, and everybody should get out and vote. Free and fair elections are a rare privilege. There's only about 20 countries in the world that have them, so we should celebrate the rights of democracy.
Only 20, it's amazing. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, and all the very best.
Thanks for listening to the Fidelity Connects podcast. Now, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to Fidelity Connects on your podcast platform of choice. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a review or a 5-star rating. Fidelity mutual funds and ETFs are available by working with a financial advisor or through an online brokerage account. Visit fidelity.ca/how-to-buy for more information. On fidelity.ca, you can also find more information on future live webcasts. And don't forget to follow Fidelity Canada on X. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Fidelity Investments Canada ULC or its affiliates. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment, tax, or legal advice. It is not an offer to sell or buy, or an endorsement, recommendation, or sponsorship of any entity or security cited. Read a fund's prospectus before investing. Funds are not guaranteed. Their values change frequently, and past performance may not be repeated. Fees, expenses, and commissions are all associated with fund investments. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.